This poor man had just finished work and was about to go home when he was suddenly hit from behind by someone driving a car. He got out of the car angrily and wanted to question the person who caused the accident. Unexpectedly, he saw the other person driving a Rolls-Royce. Inside the car was a young woman who exuded luxury and wealth. The man saw this and immediately changed his expression to a gentle one. He didn't even dare to ask the woman to explain. Unexpectedly, when the man turned around, he saw that the woman was bleeding. It was obvious that she had a miscarriage. Gong was an obstetrician, so he immediately carried the woman to the hospital. He then made a plan to perform emergency surgery on her until the girl took off her sunglasses, and only then did Gong realize that she was the daughter of the nation's top tycoon. Go-eun had just broken up with her boyfriend and was feeling down, convinced that there were no good men left in the world. Faced with a millionaire heiress, Gong didn't try to flatter her, but his tone was gentle. He reassured Go-eun to trust her doctor and everything would be fine. Go-eun then entered the anesthesia phase, and the surgery was carried out to remove the child from her womb. Unexpectedly, a few days later, a group of men in black stormed into Gong office, forcibly dragged him into a car. Inside was Go-eun's father, the chairman of the most powerful conglomerate in South Korea. The moment he saw Gong the chairman yelled at him, accusing him of severing his family's bloodline and demanding that Gong take full responsibility. That night, under the chairman's orders, the subordinates dragged Gong to the seaside to throw him into the ocean. On the brink of life and death, Gong still held firmly to his beliefs as a doctor and stated plainly that, for the safety of the mother, he would make the same decision again if given the chance. In the end, the chairman spared Gong life out of mercy, but as punishment, he was fired. From that moment on, no hospital was willing to hire Gong again. Desperate to find work, Gong made countless phone calls, but even the worst jobs weren't available to him. Then one day, Go-eun suddenly appeared and told him she would compensate him. She had seen everything, how the chairman scolded Gong and realized that this might truly be a rare good man. However, Gong felt nothing but resentment toward Go-eun because it was because of her that he had lost his entire career. Even the lowest jobs wouldn't take him. Unexpectedly, Go-eun suddenly grabbed Gong and kissed him passionately. After the kiss, she confessed that she really liked him. Gong was utterly shocked and, in his confusion, quickly rejected the rich heiress's confession. But not long after, one night while he was drunk at a small local eatery, Go-eun appeared again. This time, taking advantage of his drunken state, Gong threw himself into Go-eun's arms, and that night, the two had a passionate night together. Afterward, Go-eun once again boldly expressed her love, this time even more directly. She told Gong that she wanted to marry him. Gong thought he wasn't worthy of her, yet for some reason, he no longer refused. From that moment, the poor man Gong suddenly became the future son-in-law of a wealthy family. Not long after, the conglomerate spent an enormous sum of 700 billion won to send Gong into space for an 8-day mission. His task was to research the mystery of sperm genetics in a space laboratory. That night, the spaceship carrying Gong entered its countdown for launch. As the command was given from Earth, the rocket launched into the night sky toward the vastness of space. However, just seconds after takeoff, it was struck by lightning. Gong who had never experienced outer space before, was nearly in shock. Fortunately, the spacecraft was well designed and managed to pass through the storm safely, continuing its ascent. Once the ship entered Earth's orbit, Gong saw the blue planet from a unique perspective for the first time. Since it was his first time in space, he couldn't hold back from severe space sickness, even experiencing hallucinations. He saw a human corpse in a spacesuit walking outside. Gong couldn't stop vomiting, and soon after, he began experiencing airway obstruction, eventually losing consciousness. Commander Eve immediately began emergency treatment. The space environment was extremely unique. They had only 7 minutes to save Gong before he would die. Eve contacted the medical team on Earth for direct guidance. Following instructions, they had to use a method to remove the obstruction. Inside the zero-gravity spacecraft, Eve braced her foot against the elevator from behind and used all her strength to perform abdominal thrusts on Gong Eventually, thanks to Eve's efforts, the foreign object in Gong esophagus was successfully expelled. When he regained consciousness, the first person he saw was the beautiful Commander Eve, who had injured her toe during the rescue. Eve had her own story. She once had a romantic relationship with a colleague at the Earth Command Center, but their missions forced them to part temporarily. Once Gong vital signs stabilized, he contacted the command center and knew that what he had seen earlier was not a hallucination. It wasn't a corpse, but a satellite made from an abandoned spacesuit. While Gong was alone, Eve came in and tucked a thermometer inside his suit, making him suddenly feel hot. When their break time arrived, they shut off communication with Earth. Gong kindly reminded Eve that her toe was still bleeding. As he attempted first aid, he discovered that the wound was severe. A simple band-aid wouldn't be enough. Eve needed surgery to stop the bleeding. Gong confidently opened the medical kit and pulled out a needle and thread. However, In the zero-gravity environment, it was difficult for him to maintain balance. Despite trying many times, he just couldn't thread the needle. Eve couldn't bear to watch any longer, so she quickly snatched the needle and thread from him. Drawing on her experience as a commander, Eve succeeded in threading it in a single attempt. She then assigned the remaining task, anesthetizing and stitching the wound, to Gong. However, the syringe for the anesthetic had mysteriously disappeared from the first aid kit. Panicking, Gong searched everywhere for it, but Eve told him to proceed with the stitching anyway. To her, a bit of pain was nothing. When Gong hesitated, Eve even offered to do it herself. That finally pushed Gong to start stitching and bandaging the wound. The entire procedure went smoothly. After finishing the operation, Gong suddenly saw the missing syringe floating right in front of him. Startled, he carefully blew it away, not forgetting to secretly glance at Eve's reaction. Eve simply patted his shoulder and went downstairs. Gong then muttered to himself that Eve's toes were really beautiful. While Gong was in space, his girlfriend, Go-eun, was constantly worried about him. In fact, this mission into space was a secret assignment given by the chairman. If Gong failed to complete it, the chairman would force him to break up with Go-eun. Go-eun was filled with anxiety, often reminiscing about their past together. She remembered the time she confessed her feelings to Gong, only for him not to return her words of love. He merely said he would never betray her. As Go-eun was lost in her memories, her ex-boyfriend called. Her ex was a space scientist, currently also floating somewhere in the vast universe. It seemed he still had feelings for her. Over the phone, he declared that if Gong didn't treat her well, he would take her back. According to the pre-arranged plan, after entering Earth's orbit, the spacecraft needed to dock with the International Space Station. After a series of procedures, the connection between the two sides was successfully completed. Before opening the hatch, Gong took out a package. This was a gift he had prepared for the scientists. Everything was ready, but unexpectedly, Eve became fascinated by a few flies inside the cabin. She stared at them, visibly excited. The flies were resting on the surface of a banana. In front of her, a male and a female fly began to mate. Eve quickly pulled out a magnifying glass to observe more closely. This was the act of creating life in space. Gong was drawn in as well, watching alongside her. According to Eve, fly mating could last up to 20 minutes, even longer than in humans. Seeing Eve so joyful, Gong gaze unintentionally softened. After the flies finished mating, Eve carefully placed them into a test tube. She reminded Gong that in space, the most important thing was to create and protect life. But Gong started joking, saying he would name the male fly Gong and the female fly Eve. Eve firmly rejected the idea and told him to call her Commander only. After securing the flies properly, Eve opened the hatch. Gong clumsily floated out of the module. He still hadn't gotten used to the zero-gravity environment. He met several scientists aboard the space station, one of whom, named Kan-soo, turned out to be Go-eun's ex-boyfriend. After the introduction, Gong unwrapped the gift he had brought, a selection of ice cream in various flavors. But in fact, the delicious, melt-in-your-mouth ice cream held a secret tied to Gong mission in space. It turned out that the chairman's son was infertile, something that had long troubled the chairman. Some time ago, his daughter-in-law Min-jung had given him a report. According to scientific research, in a zero-gravity environment, deformed sperm can straighten and recover normally. In order to secure succession of the corporation, Min-jung proposed sending Gong into space to secretly fertilize her egg there. Upon receiving the chairman's orders, Gong first reaction was to refuse. Sending human eggs into space was completely against protocol, but the chairman revealed that his son's sperm had already been sent into space earlier. Gong only needed to bring the egg. If the chairman succeeded in having a grandson, he would seriously consider Gong relationship with his daughter. Even when the chairman got down on his knees and begged, Gong still firmly refused. Later, Gong met Min-jung to try and persuade her to give up the idea. However, Min-jung was even more determined than the chairman. In fact, she was Gong colleague, a pediatrician who loved children. She earnestly pleaded with Gong to help fulfill her wish of becoming a mother. In the end, Gong was moved and agreed to carry out the secret mission. Min-jung's egg was hidden at the bottom of a vanilla ice cream container. Now in space, Gong distributed ice cream to everyone, each flavor carefully chosen based on their preferences. After handing them out, 2 sticks remained. Among them was the vanilla ice cream containing Min-jung's egg. By coincidence, Eve happened to pick up the vanilla one. Gong panicked, rushed after her, and asked her to return it. But Eve grew suspicious. According to protocol, everyone going into space was required to declare all personal items they brought along. Gong insisted that he had declared everything, but Eve wouldn't let it go. She knew he had only listed 5 ice creams in his inventory, and the vanilla one wasn't among them. Panicking, Gong started lying, saying he had just accidentally brought a small cup of ice cream and that it was no big deal, just a small oversight. However, suspected he had hidden something dangerous inside, and even placed the ice cream into the oven to melt it completely so she could clearly see what was inside. Gong, a alarmed, immediately tried to take it out, but Eve pointed a gun at him from behind, forcing him to freeze. Taking the opportunity, Eve scooped a spoonful of the melted ice cream and placed it into a testing device. Fortunately, the results showed it was completely non-toxic, with a 100% safety rating. Relieved, Eve handed a spoonful back to Gong Ryong to eat. Trying to avoid suspicion, Gong Ryong reluctantly ate it, but just as he finished, Eve snatched the container from him, reminding him that in space, reducing waste volume was important. Without hesitation, she threw the cup into the trash bag. Watching this, Gong Ryong gasped in fury and quickly pulled the cup out of the trash, then frantically opened the bottom. To his shock, Minjung's egg was gone. What Gong Ryong didn't know was that the real ice cream cup containing the eggs was now in the hands of Go-eun's ex-boyfriend, Kang-soo. Not only did Kang-soo get the egg, but he also obtained the sperm of the chairman's son. At this point, Go-eun finally realized her father had deceived her boyfriend. In truth, Gong Ryong was merely a delivery man tasked with bringing the eggs into space hidden in the ice cream. The embryo experiment had nothing to do with him. Clearly, the chairman didn't trust Gong Ryong's abilities and never actually considered marrying off his daughter to him. Desperate, Gong Ryong searched the entire space station for the eggs. At that moment, Go-eun called him and revealed everything. Upon knowing the truth, Gong Ryong immediately confronted Kang-soo and demanded the eggs back. But with a mere gesture, Kang-soo sent Gong Ryong tumbling like a puppet across the space station. Kang-soo still wouldn't give up. He insulted Gong Ryong, calling him a poor nobody, unworthy of marrying a chaebol heiress. Kang-soo advised him to stop deluding himself and give up while he could, insisting that he and Go-eun were the ones truly meant for each other. Kang-soo wasn't just a scientist specializing in fruit flies and infertility, he was also the heir to a global banking empire. But Gong Ryong wasn't someone who gave up easily. He had already made a deal with chairman to establish a reproductive clinic in space to help people with infertility conceive children. Driven by this noble mission, Gong Ryong entered his second day aboard the space station. Just then, an alarm blared through the station. Experimental mouse number 1, a female, was biting the other 2 mice. Ground control ordered Eve to euthanize mouse number 1, but she was too afraid, terrified of taking a life in the vacuum of space. Suddenly, mouse number 1 suffered a heart attack. The scientists were at a loss. Gong Ryong proposed performing open-heart surgery on the mouse, a procedure he had done over 100 times on newborns. With Eve's approval, Gong Ryong sprang into action, pressing on the tiny heart of the mouse as its breathing grew weaker. Meanwhile, Kang-soo stood nearby, mocking him with sarcastic remarks. But Gong Ryong refused to give in. The dying mouse in front of him mirrored his own desperate situation. He saw himself in it, and that gave him a surge of resolve. Then he switched places with Eve, and they continued chest compressions together. Perhaps it was the power of belief, but eventually, thanks to their combined efforts, the mouse's heartbeat was restored. Seeing a tiny life saved, Eve was so overjoyed that she burst into tears. In her excitement, she hugged Gong Ryong tightly and praised him as the most wonderful doctor. She even specially allowed Gong Ryong to call her by her name. Gong Ryong's heart raced uncontrollably at Eve's admiring gaze and smile. Today, the expedition team and scientists were resting. Kang-soo suggested watching the lottery results together. As the commander, Eve went into the lounge to find Gong Ryong to join them. Gong Ryong was looking at photos of his girlfriend, but his mind kept replaying the image of Eve hugging him. Not long ago, after calling Gong Ryong, the group gathered in front of the screen, intently following the lottery draw. During this time, Kang-soo volunteered to get coffee for everyone. What no one knew was that while they were focused on the lottery results, Kang-soo secretly entered the laboratory to prepare fertilization for the eggs Gong Ryong had brought. After a series of experiments, Kang-soo, as a scientist, succeeded in normalizing the sperm in the zero-gravity environment. Unfortunately, Gong Ryong came looking for him. Not wanting to get caught, Kang-soo only injected 7 eggs and quickly ended the process. He then called the chairman to share this good news, confident that these 7 eggs would successfully fertilize, resulting in 7 grandchildren. The chairman felt very lucky to have entrusted this important task to Kang-soo instead of Gong Ryong. Gong Ryong sneaked to the frozen storage to steal the frozen eggs, but didn't know the code to open the freezer. At that moment, Eve announced that tomorrow, the expedition team would conduct a spacewalk, so they needed to repair a damaged solar panel in space. Gong Ryong realized this was a perfect chance to create a distraction. It was the perfect opportunity for Gong Ryong to steal back the eggs. Moreover, Eve revealed to him that Kang-soo would be participating in the spacewalk scheduled for tomorrow. During that time, Kang-soo would be outside the station for several hours. Gong Ryong was thrilled and quickly asked Eve if there was a chance someone might not return from a spacewalk. Unexpectedly, Eve replied that spacewalking was extremely dangerous. In addition to Kang-soo, she herself would also be joining. Hearing this, Gong Ryong grew anxious about Eve's safety. Before they came to space, Eve had told him that going on a spacewalk was like choosing death. Even experienced astronauts would write their wills before such missions, because the tiniest mistake, like a small tear in a glove, could be fatal in under 2 minutes. Commander Eve had long since accepted the fact that her life could end at any moment, but Gong responded seriously, saying that as the leader, she should carry the belief that she would survive until the end. Eve brushed him off, calling him nosy, but deep down, she felt a sense of warmth. To prepare for the worst before embarking on the spacewalk, Eve began writing her will. Meanwhile, Kang-soo was on a video call to Earth with his ex-girlfriend. Go-in berated him harshly, accusing him of being shameless. She demanded he return Min-jung's egg to Gong-ryong, saying that it was something Gong-ryong should be the one to do. But of course, Kang-soo refused. Not only did he want to take Min-jung's eggs, but he also wanted to compete with Gong-ryong for Go-in. Furious, Go-in couldn't hold back. On the other end of the line, she unleashed a storm of curses, using every vulgar word she could think of to lash out at Kang-soo. However, what nobody expected was that Kang-soo was not someone easily provoked. The more Go-in scolded fiercely, the more Kang-soo found her beautiful and charming. Go-in couldn't even understand how she had once loved such an inferior man. She said that when he returned, she would teach him a lesson. While the astronauts were all preparing for the upcoming mission, Gong-ryong once again sneaked to the freezer, but was powerless because he couldn't enter the correct password. In urgency, Gong-ryong contacted a doctor friend on Earth and explained the situation, that a woman's eggs had been taken, asking for advice. Hearing the sound of the centrifuge spinning nearby Gong-ryong, his friend confirmed that if the centrifuge overheated, it could explode. The space station's power would then be suddenly cut to prevent danger to the experiment subject in case of fire. At that time, the freezer would automatically open. Gong-ryong then came up with a plan. He intended to make the treadmill run until it caught fire, triggering the fire alarm automatically. His friend warned him this was very dangerous, but Gong-ryong insisted on going through with it. This was his only chance to retrieve Min-jung's eggs. Meanwhile, Eve had finished writing and printing her last letter when she noticed a test tube under the computer. Excited, she went to find Gong-ryong and saw photos of Go-in hanging in both Gong-ryong's and Kang-soo's resting rooms. She suddenly felt Go-in was very lucky to be loved by two men. At the same time, Eve handed the test tube to Gong-ryong to look at. It contained the result of the mating between the two flies. Eve was as delighted as a child because creating life in zero gravity was truly no easy feat. Eve reminded Gong-ryong that under no circumstances could Kang-soo find out about this. Otherwise, the two flies would surely be treated as test subjects and face cruel experimentation. Gong-ryong firmly stated that he wouldn't let Kang-soo take away anything else that belonged to him. Noticing that Gong-ryong was fidgety because of his girlfriend, Eve teased him. Gong-ryong said he hoped that once they returned to Earth, he could meet Eve in a gravity-filled environment. Eve smiled gently and handed him her will. No one knew if she would make it back to Earth safely after this mission. At that moment, seeing that the two flies in the test tube were about to reproduce, Eve laughed with joy. Gong-ryong too was excited and happy. Finally, the time came for the spacewalk mission. While Eve and Kang-soo were heading toward the assigned location, Gong-ryong made his way to the cold storage unit. He called Min-jung to ask whether she wanted Kang-soo to be in charge of her egg. Fortunately, Min-jung didn't trust Kang-soo. She trusted Gong-ryong, a responsible OBGYN. She needed him to continuously monitor the development of the embryo and promised to convince the chairman to let him perform the operation. Being entrusted with such responsibility gave Gong-ryong peace of mind and erased all his doubts. He resolved to retrieve the egg at all costs. After ending the call with Min-jung, Gong-ryong followed through with the plan and began frantically running on the treadmill. Meanwhile, Eve and Kang-soo, suited in their spacesuits, had started repairing the solar panels. A few hours later, most of the work was nearly done when Kang-soo's glove encountered an issue. Ground control immediately ordered him to return to the station, and Eve also urged him to head back at once, or he would be putting his life in danger. With the main tasks completed, the remaining work would be finished by Eve alone. Kang-soo returned to the space station. At the same time, an alarm sounded throughout the station. It was triggered by Gong-ryong's intense workout on the treadmill. The motor was overloaded and sparked. As Gong-ryong had predicted, the space station's emergency system cut power, unlocking all equipment in the laboratory, including the freezer. Taking advantage of this moment, Gong-ryong quickly retrieved the eggs from the freezer and hid them inside his portable music player. Since there was only smoke and no actual fire, the alarm was lifted a few minutes later and the power to the space station was restored. The other astronauts suspected nothing. Overjoyed to have Min-jung's eggs back, Gong-ryong felt immense relief. When the crisis ended, Eve continued to work alone on the final repairs. Unexpectedly, during the process, she made a mistake. The tool on the rail was accidentally released into space. Any tool falling like this could become a dangerous object, hitting the space station. Because of this, Eve tried to reach out and grab the tool, but unfortunately slipped off the mount. Her body began drifting in space, creating a very dangerous situation. Using the safety tether attached to her, Eve tried to grab the solar panel to stabilize herself, but in doing so, her glove was pierced by components of the solar panel. The colleagues inside the station tried to maneuver to bring Eve back, but were powerless due to the great distance. If this continued, Eve would run out of oxygen within minutes and die. Even more dangerous was that the damaged area on her glove kept increasing. The spacesuit's system issued warnings that Eve's oxygen levels were steadily dropping. At the same time, Gong read the farewell letter Eve had left for him. In the letter, Eve recalled the most important person in her life, her foster father, an astronaut from America. He had sacrificed his life during a spacewalk to save a fellow crewmate. Eva's adoptive father left her a letter before his death. In the vast universe, all life is equal and miraculous. Humans are not gods. Because of his dying wish, Eve learned to cherish every living being. In her own letter, every part of her final will was about life. She reminded Gong to take good care of the injured crew members, the lab mice, and many other things. She even repeatedly reminded him about eating chili paste and dealing with bodily waste. In Zero Gravity, every human action is connected to life itself. One thing she emphasized most was this: no matter what happened, Gong must stay in place. She wanted him to value his own life. If Gong could follow her instructions, then Eve promised that when she returned to Earth someday, she would definitely invite him for a drink. Gong obeyed her words completely until an emergency alert came from the space station. The worst had truly happened. Gong quickly checked on Eve's current situation. Due to the distance, Eve could no longer reach the robotic arm, so her entire body was left lying on the solar panel. As her oxygen continued to deplete, she could no longer remain fully conscious. With coordination from Mission Control on Earth, Eve used the last of her strength to try to anchor herself. But Mission Control was ultimately helpless in the current situation. Everyone was panicking,